There are moments that do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, like a pressure in your chest you can't explain, like a heaviness that follows you into the night. You lie there awake, staring into the dark, replaying conversations, moments, choices, not because you enjoy the pain, but because your spirit is searching for truth. You loved with intention. You showed up with sincerity, and somehow, that love became the place where you slowly disappeared. You keep asking yourself where you went wrong. You search for the exact moment when care turned into confusion, when devotion turned into exhaustion. You wonder how something that once felt meaningful began to hollow you out from the inside. And the most unsettling part is not the loss of the relationship. It's the loss of yourself within it. The silence after it ended feels louder than any argument ever did. This is where the real work begins. Because beneath the surface of all that pain is a question you've been avoiding, not because it's dangerous, but because it's powerful. What if this did not happen to you as a mistake? What if it was not random, not unfair, not meaningless? What if this experience entered your life because something in you was being shaped, not broken, but exposed? You were not naive for trusting. You were not foolish for hoping. You were operating from depth in a world that often survives on masks. And when depth meets emptiness, friction is inevitable. That friction didn't come to destroy you. It came to show you where you were giving without being met, where you were explaining instead of being understood, where you were shrinking your truth to keep peace that was never real. You didn't lose yourself overnight. You drifted away in small moments. When you ignored your intuition, when you stayed quiet to avoid conflict, when you accepted confusion as the cost of connection. You told yourself it was patience. You called it loyalty. But somewhere deep down, you felt the tension between who you were becoming and what you were tolerating. And that tension was not weakness. It was awareness knocking. What finally changed you was not the pain itself, but the clarity it forced upon you. The realization that love should not feel like survival, that peace does not require constant negotiation, that your worth was never meant to be proven through endurance. When you began to see that, something shifted. Not outside of you, within you. You stopped trying to fix what refused to grow. You stopped explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. And in that moment, even if it felt like loss, you reclaimed something far more important than a relationship. You reclaimed alignment. This is the truth that settles quietly, but carries weight. You were not shattered by that experience. You were rearranged. You were moved closer to yourself. And once that happens, you cannot unsee what you now know. The confusion fades, the noise softens, and what remains is a grounded awareness, the kind that no one can take from you again. What changed you was not the pain. It was the awakening that followed. There is a quiet moment that arrives after the damage is done. Not loud, not dramatic, just still. It's the moment when you finally stop defending what hurt you and start listening to what it revealed. You sit with the truth longer than you planned to. You feel it in your chest, heavy but honest, and for the first time you begin to sense that what you called love may have been something else entirely. You remember how it began. The intensity. The feeling of being seen, needed, chosen. It felt purposeful, almost fated. You told yourself this depth meant something real, something rare. But slowly, without ceremony, the cost of that connection began to surface. You started shrinking parts of yourself to keep the bond alive. You silenced instincts. You postponed your own needs. Not because you were weak, but because you believed love required sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was you. What unsettles you now is not just the pain, but the clarity that follows it. You realize how much of yourself you handed over in small, almost invisible ways. You gave patience where honesty was needed. You gave understanding where boundaries should have stood. You gave loyalty to something that was asking you to disappear just enough to stay manageable. And this is where the illusion begins to crack. Because what entered your life did not come to stay, it came to confront. It came to expose the places where you had learned to equate intensity with intimacy, endurance with devotion, and emotional labor with worth. You weren't invited into love. You were invited into awareness. You see now that the connection forced you to face yourself, not the version you present to the world, but the one shaped by old wounds and quiet agreements you never realized you made. Agreements to tolerate, confusion, to earn affection, to explain your pain instead of honoring it. This experience pressed on those agreements until they could no longer survive the pressure, and in that breaking, something essential happened. You woke up. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. With each moment of discomfort you could no longer ignore, with each realization that peace was leaving the room whenever you stayed, with each internal protest that grew louder than your fear of losing them. You began to understand that love does not require you to abandon yourself to prove its value. This was not betrayal. It was instruction. The connection served its purpose the moment you stopped asking how to save it and started asking what it was teaching you. It taught you where you overgave, where you negotiated your truth, where you confused hope with responsibility. And once that lesson surfaced, staying would have meant unlearning yourself again. You were not meant to hold on forever. You were meant to see clearly. And now, standing on this side of the experience, something is different. You no longer reach for intensity to feel alive. You no longer chase clarity from confusion. You no longer mistake familiarity for safety. What once felt like loss now feels like alignment returning quietly to its rightful place. The invitation was never love as you understood it. It was awakening. There is a moment when the blame finally loosens its grip. Not because someone explains it away, but because something inside you grows tired of carrying it. You sit with the weight of what happened and realize how often you asked yourself the wrong question. Not why were they like that, but what was wrong with me? That question followed you quietly, shaping your thoughts, your sleep, your sense of worth, and for a long time, you believed the answer must live inside your own flaws. But strength is rarely recognized while it's being tested. You were patient when others would have hardened. You listened when others would have shut down. You extended understanding long after it stopped being returned. And instead of being seen as depth, those qualities were treated as openings. You were not met with care. You were met with consumption. Slowly, subtly, you were made to feel that your empathy was excessive, your sensitivity inconvenient, your steadiness something to be taken rather than respected. That's where the confusion began. You wondered how being so present could lead to being diminished, how showing up fully could result in being blamed for everything that went wrong. And so you turned inward. You questioned your instincts. You wondered if you were too much, or not enough, or somehow miswired for connection. You tried to correct yourself instead of questioning the dynamic. But strength does not announce itself with force. It often moves quietly, steady and open, trusting where others calculate. What you carried into that connection was not weakness, it was capacity. The ability to hold space, the willingness to see potential, the courage to stay present when things became uncomfortable, and to someone who survives by control rather than growth. That kind of presence feels threatening. Not because it demands anything, but because it reflects what they lack. You weren't targeted because you were fragile. You were targeted because you were grounded. That realization changes the shape of the memory. You begin to see how your emotional depth became a resource for someone who did not know how to generate their own. How your steadiness stabilized chaos that was never yours to manage. How your patience allowed patterns to continue longer than they should have, not because you deserved it, but because you were capable of enduring more than most. And endurance, when misunderstood, becomes permission. This is where dignity returns, quietly, without drama. You recognize that nothing about you needed fixing. What needed adjusting was where you placed your strength. You see now that not everyone who needs warmth deserves access to your fire. That not everyone who is drawn to light is willing to become accountable in its presence. You stop viewing your empathy as a liability and start understanding it as something sacred, something that must be protected, not endlessly offered. You realize that patience without boundaries becomes self-erasure, and compassion without discernment turns into quiet self-betrayal. The shame dissolves when you understand this. Your strength didn't fail you. It revealed where it was being misused. And now, standing here with clearer eyes, you no longer confuse intensity with connection. You no longer offer depth to emptiness and call it hope. You know the difference between being kind and being consumed. Strength was never the problem. It was the signal. At first, nothing feels wrong. That's the most dangerous part. There is no alarm, no breaking point you can point to and say, "This is where I disappeared." Life continues. Conversations continue. You keep showing up. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, something begins to thin out. You feel it in the pauses where you almost speak and then decide not to. In the moments when your body reacts before your mind catches up and you tell yourself it's nothing. You don't abandon yourself all at once. You step away quietly. It begins with small adjustments. You soften your tone to keep the peace. You delay your needs because the timing never feels right. You explain away discomfort because you don't want to seem difficult. Each time it feels reasonable, even noble. You tell yourself this is what commitment looks like. This is what love requires. And because you are capable of enduring, you do. But endurance has a cost when it replaces truth. You start ignoring the signals you once trusted. The tightness in your chest becomes familiar. The exhaustion feels normal. You learn how to manage the tension instead of questioning why it's there. Survival becomes a skill. And survival, when repeated long enough, starts to feel like devotion. You mistake your ability to withstand discomfort for proof that you belong there. You don't notice the erosion because it's subtle. It happens in the space between who you are and who you're becoming. You stop asking for clarity and start settling for reassurance. You stop naming what hurts and start managing how much you can take. And each time you do, you move a little farther from yourself. Not out of fear, but out of hope. Hope can be blinding when it's the only thing keeping you steady. You justify what doesn't sit right. You rationalize what drains you. You tell yourself that if you're patient enough, kind enough, consistent enough, things will stabilize. But what's really happening is that you're adapting to an environment that requires you to stay smaller than you are. And adaptation, when it demands silence, slowly reshapes identity. This is not failure, it's conditioning. One day you catch yourself feeling unfamiliar in your own life. You struggle to recognize your reactions. You wonder why things that once mattered now feel distant. You feel tired in a way rest doesn't fix. And that's when the awareness begins to surface. Not as panic, but as clarity. You see that what you called sacrifice was actually self-erasure, practiced in small daily increments. You were surviving, not choosing. And the moment you recognize that, the erosion loses its power. You begin to remember who you were before everything required explanation, before you learned to override yourself, before your silence became a strategy. The awareness doesn't shame you. It steadies you. because now you can see that nothing was wrong with your capacity to love, only with where that capacity was being spent. You understand finally that losing yourself didn't happen because you weren't strong enough to hold on. It happened because you were strong enough to endure what should have required departure. And once you see that, you stop disappearing. Quietly, permanently. There comes a moment when the questions change. You stop asking why it felt so powerful, so consuming, so impossible to walk away from. And instead, you begin asking why it reached you so deeply in the first place. That moment is quiet, almost unsettling, because it asks you to look inward, not backward. And that was never the plan when you were still trying to make sense of them. The bond felt intense because it bypassed logic and went straight to the places in you that were still open. It didn't knock on the door of reason. It entered through familiarity, through emotion, through the unspoken parts of you that learned long ago to associate closeness with uncertainty and love with tension. That's why it didn't feel ordinary. It felt charged, magnetic, almost necessary. But intensity is not proof of depth. What you experienced wasn't a reflection of who they were to become. It was a reflection of what you were still carrying. Old needs that never found language. Old wounds that learned to survive instead of heal. The connection touched those places and lit them up, not to complete you, but to reveal what was unfinished. And because those wounds were quiet, unresolved, they mistook recognition for destiny. You weren't seeing them. You were seeing yourself. That's why the bond felt addictive. Not because it was meaningful, but because it offered the illusion of resolution. You believed that if you could just hold on, just understand enough, just love deeply enough, something inside you would finally settle. But mirrors don't heal. They show. And the longer you stared into that reflection, the more you tried to fix what was never yours to fix. Obsession grows where clarity is missing. You chased answers because the reflection kept shifting. One moment it validated you, the next it withdrew. That inconsistency didn't confuse you by accident. It activated old patterns, the ones that learned to work harder when connection felt threatened. And so you stayed engaged, not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. Familiar to the nervous system. Familiar to the heart that learned early how to adapt. This realization doesn't accuse you. It frees you, because once you see that the relationship was a mirror, not a promise, the grip loosens. You stop trying to extract meaning from someone else's behavior and start understanding what it revealed about your own unmet needs. You see how the intensity was never about union, but about exposure. How the confusion was never a sign to try harder, but a signal to look deeper. And that's when recognition replaces obsession. You no longer need to replay the moments or decode the silence. You no longer ask what they meant or what you could have done differently. The mirror has already done its work. It showed you where you were seeking validation instead of alignment, where you were trying to heal through attachment instead of awareness. Now you see the difference. You understand that what felt like chemistry was actually resonance with unresolved pain, that what felt sacred was simply familiar, and that familiarity, when seen clearly, loses its power, because you are no longer searching for completion in reflection. You are reclaiming it within yourself. You didn't lose something real when it ended. You gained sight. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from loving without protection. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady draining you can't explain to anyone else. You feel it when you wake up already tired, when kindness starts to feel heavy, when your heart keeps reaching forward while something inside you keeps pulling back. That's the moment you begin to sense that something sacred in you is being misused. You didn't enter that connection without awareness. You entered it with compassion. You believed patience could soften hardness. You believed understanding could create safety. You believed that if you stayed steady enough, loving enough, present enough, something would change. And so you gave more. Not because you were unaware, but because you were hopeful. But compassion, when left unguarded, becomes exposure. You began to excuse what should have been questioned. You explained away what consistently hurt. You absorbed emotional weight that was never yours to carry. And each time you did, you told yourself this was love, that this was maturity, that this was what it meant to care deeply. But quietly, almost invisibly, compassion turned against you. You were not betrayed by them first. You were betrayed by the moment you stopped listening to yourself. Discernment isn't coldness. It isn't judgment. It is self-respect in motion. And when discernment is absent, compassion becomes permission. Permission for patterns to continue, for boundaries to erode, for responsibility to shift onto the one who feels the most. You didn't notice it happening because you were focused on being good rather than being aligned. You kept your heart open, even when your spirit was signaling retreat. And that's the cost. Compassion without discernment doesn't just hurt. It teaches you to override your own truth. You begin questioning your reactions instead of the behavior that caused them. You soften your voice when clarity is required. You give grace where accountability should live. Over time, you learn to manage discomfort instead of addressing its source. That isn't love. That is self-abandonment disguised as virtue. The turning point doesn't come when you stop caring. It comes when you stop sacrificing yourself to prove that you do. When you realize that empathy is not meant to be endless access. That kindness is not an obligation to stay where you are depleted. That love does not require you to ignore the evidence in front of you. You were not meant to heal someone at the cost of your own integrity. Once this realization settles, something changes. You begin to pause where you once pushed through. You listen where you once explained. You recognize that discernment is not a rejection of compassion. It is its guardian. It ensures that what you give is received in truth, not exploited in silence. You stop confusing endurance with devotion. You stop calling pain growth. You stop betraying yourself to maintain connection. And in that moment, compassion returns to its rightful place, not as a weapon against you, but as a strength guided by wisdom. You don't become colder. You become clearer. You don't love less. You love with direction. Because the most profound act of compassion you will ever practice is refusing to abandon yourself again. At some point, the story stops being about them. Not because what happened didn't matter, but because you begin to see that it fits into something older, quieter, and far more revealing. The realization doesn't arrive with blame, it arrives with gravity. A sense that this connection felt familiar long before it became painful, and that familiarity was never accidental. You start noticing the echoes, the way you learned early on to stay alert to emotional shifts, the way you adapted instead of asked, the way love, for you, always carried a trace of tension, something to manage, something to earn, something to hold together through effort. You didn't choose that consciously. You inherited it. You learned it in environments where connection came with conditions, where silence felt safer than honesty, where keeping the peace mattered more than being seen. And so when this relationship appeared, it didn't feel strange, it felt known. That's the unsettling truth. You didn't recognize the pattern because it was loud. You recognized it because it was quiet. It matched the emotional climate your nervous system already understood, the unpredictability, the push and pull, the sense that if you just stayed aware enough, careful enough, loving enough, things would stabilize. That belief didn't begin here. It was rehearsed long before this chapter. This is not about fault. It's about awareness. You see now how easily familiarity disguises itself as chemistry, How repetition can feel like destiny when it's actually conditioning replaying itself. You weren't chasing pain. You were following a blueprint written before you had the language to question it. And the relationship followed that blueprint precisely, until it couldn't anymore. Because something in you began to resist. The discomfort you felt wasn't weakness, it was evolution. A part of you had outgrown the pattern and could no longer live inside it without protest. That's why the tension increased. That's why staying felt heavier than leaving. The pattern was being challenged by awareness, and awareness always disrupts repetition. You were becoming the interruption. This is where the meaning shifts. You understand that the relationship didn't just happen to you, it happened through you. It brought the pattern to the surface so it could finally be seen. Named. Ended. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but consciously, and consciousness is where cycles lose their grip. You are no longer confusing endurance with love. You are no longer mistaking emotional labor for connection. You are no longer willing to inherit what costs you yourself. That's what makes this moment different from all the ones before it. You didn't just leave a person. You stepped out of a loop. You chose not to repeat what once felt inevitable, and that choice carries weight. Not just for you, but for everything that comes after. Patterns persist until someone becomes aware enough to stop them. And now, standing here with clearer eyes, you can trace the line backward without being trapped by it. You see how the past shaped you, but you also see where it ends. With you, with this awareness, with the decision to no longer call familiarity love if it requires your disappearance. The pattern did not start with them, but it does end with you. There is a moment when the noise fades and something far more unsettling takes its place. It isn't anger. It isn't even sadness. It's the absence of peace. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but lingers quietly in your body. You feel it when conversations that once felt natural begin to feel heavy. When your breath shortens for no clear reason, when being present requires effort instead of ease. You notice it, but you don't name it right away. At first, you assume it's stress, timing, fatigue. You tell yourself that every relationship goes through seasons, that discomfort is normal, that this is just part of commitment. And so you stay. You adjust. You wait for the feeling to pass. But it doesn't. It deepens. Not dramatically, steadily. Like a low hum beneath everything you do. Peace doesn't leave suddenly. It withdraws when something no longer aligns. You begin to feel divided. Part of you wants to explain, to fix, to restore what once felt right. Another part of you grows quieter, more distant, as if it's stepping back to observe. You feel tension in moments that used to feel safe. Your body reacts before your mind catches up. And for the first time, you start to sense that this isn't confusion, it's information. Truth often arrives without permission. It doesn't ask whether you're ready to hear it. It simply removes what no longer fits. That's why the absence of peace feels so disorienting. You're not losing something you need. You're being separated from something you've outgrown, but growth doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like restlessness, like agitation, like an inner resistance that refuses to quiet down. You try to talk yourself out of it. You remind yourself of the good moments. You focus on potential. You look for reasons to stay grounded in what was instead of what is. But peace does not respond to arguments. It responds to alignment. And the more you ignore that signal, the louder it becomes. This is where the shift happens. You realize that peace was never the reward for staying. It was the compass pointing you forward. Its absence wasn't punishment, it was direction. A signal that your internal truth had moved ahead of your circumstances. that the version of you who could tolerate this no longer exists. You begin to see that clarity doesn't always come with certainty. Sometimes it comes with discomfort that refuses to be managed, a sense that something is complete, even if the ending hasn't been agreed upon. You stop asking how to make it feel right again and start asking why it doesn't. And the answer is simple, though not easy. Because you're no longer meant to live there. Peace didn't leave to confuse you. It left to guide you. Once you understand that, you stop chasing reassurance. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop mistaking anxiety for investment. You trust what your body and spirit have been signaling long before your mind caught up. You don't need a dramatic ending for truth to be valid. You don't need agreement for clarity to stand. When peace withdraws, it's not abandonment. It's truth arriving quietly, asking you to follow it forward. And when you do, you don't feel triumphant. You feel grounded, because peace was never lost. It was waiting for you on the other side of alignment. Leaving does not always look like courage in the moment. Sometimes it looks like hesitation, like grief, like standing still longer than you should because part of you is waiting for permission that never comes. You don't walk away because you stop caring. You walk away because something inside you finally refuses to keep paying the same price. At first, you try to stay awake inside it. You tell yourself you can endure a little longer. That clarity will come. That understanding will soften the edges. But the longer you remain, the more something vital begins to pull away from the situation. Quietly, decisively, not in anger, in self-preservation. That's when you realize this was never about staying strong. It was about knowing when to leave. You didn't exit because you failed. You exited because you saw clearly. You recognized that the lesson had already been delivered, and staying would only require you to unlearn what you now understood. The growth had outpaced the environment, and no amount of explanation could close that gap. You struggled with this because you were taught that leaving means giving up, that endurance is proof of character, that walking away is weakness. But what you felt wasn't collapse, it was completion. The discomfort you experienced wasn't fear of loss, it was resistance to staying misaligned. Your body knew before your mind did. You noticed how your energy shifted when you imagined a future there, how your breath tightened instead of expanding, how your thoughts grew heavy when you pictured continuing as things were. Those were not doubts. They were confirmations, signals that something in you had finished its work. The assignment was never to fix what refused to grow. The assignment was to choose yourself once you could see. Leaving didn't require a dramatic ending. It didn't need confrontation or closure or understanding from the other side. It required honesty with yourself. The honesty to admit that clarity had arrived, and ignoring it would mean betraying the very awareness you fought to gain. You weren't running away, you were stepping forward. And here's the truth that settles slowly, but changes everything. Once you saw what was happening, staying would have required pretending you didn't. Leaving was not abandonment. It was alignment. You honored what the experience taught you by, no longer asking it to teach you again. That's why the exit felt heavy and light at the same time. Heavy with grief, light with relief. Because you weren't just leaving a person or a situation. You were leaving an old version of yourself, the one who believed love required endurance without limit. Now you stand somewhere different, not triumphant, not hardened, just clear. You no longer seek permission to trust what you know. You no longer need the situation to validate your decision. The clarity itself is enough. Your exit wasn't rejection. It was resolution. And once you understand that, you stop questioning whether you left too soon or stayed too long. You see that the timing wasn't about comfort. It was about readiness. The moment you could see clearly was the moment you were meant to go. Because the assignment was never to stay and suffer. The assignment was to wake up and walk forward with what you learned.